Hello and welcome back to Simple Time Studios, where I play out epic tales of adventure for your entertainment. Continuing our everyday Grimmerspace Heroes campaign, we return to the Gliding Rim Galaxy and another member of the Cerberus crew. Can they escape this planet and the horrors on its surface? Alright, now for the setting truths that will shape our adventure. We're once again in the Grimmerspace setting, a science fiction horror setting originally created for Starfinder by Iron GM Games. Specifically, we're going to the world of Paravesh, a forested world full of giant trees roughly 1,000 feet tall and blot out the local sun with their dense canopies. Here, our protagonist is going to be on probably the hardest survey mission of her career. This will be a wilderness hex crawl where the protagonist is focused on finding a way off planet. And once again, we'll be taking a moment away from Robert Manus to focus on a new character, Corporal Samantha Autumns, the scout and survivalist of the Cerberus. Our rules and rubrics that'll help define this adventure. The primary rules will be the intergalactic beta, the solo Game Master's Guide by Geek Gamers will be used for oracles and other supplementary rules. The Book of Lost Tables will be used for wilderness generation. Everyday Heroes by Evil Genius Games will be used when necessary to supplement their beta rules. And Corporal Autumns will start her adventure as a level 3 tough explorer, using a new class from the Intergalactic Heroes beta rules. Our story begins. Blood Rain. Samantha could already tell she was going to hate this planet. While painfully aware that she had said that about more than a few of her previous postings, she was certain that this planet was going to hold a special place in her heart. Paravesh. That was the name that echoed in her mind as the Sundermage teleported her escape pod away from the others and onto this boreal nightmare. Whether that was the name of the planet she was on or the space wizard that needed a broken nose, Samantha didn't know. Certainly was a good enough name for both at the moment. Paravesh, the planet, did not appear to be a particularly unpleasant world at first. Creepy, but not unpleasant. The moment she popped open the hatch and stuck her head out of her escape pod, she saw an endless forest dominated by massive trees that bore a passing resemblance to the giant redwood forests of Earth. The forest canopy almost completely blotted out the sun, casting the lower levels in a near-perpetual state of twilight. Most of the lower plant life seems to have adapted to this life in relative darkness by use of bioluminescent pollen, but even that was relatively few and far between. Small creatures scurried between the dense underbrush, and humanoid primitives armed with stone spears took shelter in caves formed by the exposed roots of these mighty massive alien redwoods. Having surveyed multiple worlds for the Sol Federation before getting stranded on this planet, Sam immediately noticed that all the creatures on the ground seemed to have some deep-seated fear of being caught out in the open. Every creature had either developed eyeballs that could easily look upward or had a deep-seated habit of turning their head skyward as if they expected something to swoop down and snatch them up. Curious what they could be so afraid of, she decided to spend the night in the relative safety of her crashed escape pod and see what could be seen. That night, she caught her first glimpse of the planet's apex predators as they stalked a hunting party of humanoids that wandered towards her escape pod. One minute, the hunting party was right there, their faces and weapons barely visible in the dim light of their torches. The next, they disappeared in a flurry of fur, predatory shrieks, and frightened screams. As best as she could see from her angle, each of them was attacked and carried off by some furry bipedal creature the size of an adult human male. A creature that appeared to have swooped down from the trees above before carrying its prey off. With a tremble in her hands, she made sure the emergency latch on her pod was locked tight before she did her best to sleep for the rest of the night. The very first thing the next morning, she quickly grabbed her gear and went through an equipment check. Particular care was given to her rifle, her sensor helmet, and her emergency transponder, making sure they were all there and in perfect working order. Samantha knew she needed to escape. She needed to find a functional ship, or failing that, she needed to find a defensible position until help could arrive. Despite the lack of a hostile atmosphere or climate, she was fairly certain that the current apex predators, whatever they were, would get Paravesh classified as hazardous by Sol Federation standards. But that would only happen if she could get off the planet and warn others. Surveying was important, but it was still secondary to survival. With her objective clear and as ready as she was ever going to be, Samantha put her helmet on and left the safety of her escape pod. As her boots touched the soft dirt, the hardened explorer felt she was being watched by something she couldn't see. And thus begins our hex crawl as Samantha tries to escape the planet and find shelter before nightfall. She might still get attacked before nightfall, but after sundown it's practically a given. Let's begin. We're going to start with a forest hex because obviously, and once she uses her explorer ability to figure out where north is, she's going to head southward because she suspects she is north of the planet's equator. Not much of a hope, but she doesn't have a lot to go on right now either. I got a 38 on the percentile, which means the next 3-mile hex is more forest. 601% means no settlements. Samantha looked to the sky to try and track the sun's position through the dense foliage above, ignoring a faint feeling of dread that made the crimson hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The sun hadn't finished reaching the mid-morning position yet. Given the way it seemed to rise in the east and set in the west like in most planets, she quickly figured which way was north and which way was south. Oriented, she started hiking southward through the forest underbrush, taking care to keep her blaster rifle in her hands as she walked along a well-worn game trail. Minutes passed, the impact crater of her escape pod shrinking in the distance as she continued to walk southwards. The towering trees loomed over her in every direction, leaving the ground immediately around them open and clear of any foliage. Samantha didn't like stay under these trees for too long, too much open ground. If the apex predator of this planet was some kind of flyer like she suspected, she would be too exposed. Rolling another hex. 72, plains. 217 means there aren't any settlements or ruins in this hex. Going to roll the wilderness dressings table. 76. There's the foundation of a 20-foot by 30-foot stone building here. Soon she walked around the trunk of a particularly large specimen of these mammoth trees and found herself walking out through the tree line into a small meadow where the sun broke through a hole in the canopy caused by one of the megaflora falling over. The burn marks along the bottom of the tree's massive trunk told the story well enough. As she continued to walk southward, keeping the dead tree trunk to her side as a point of reference, she found the unfinished foundation of a small building partially buried in the tall grass. It wasn't a particularly large building, about the size of a small house, but it was made with what looked like modern reinforced concrete. Were there other off-worlders that had visited this planet previously or currently? Were the locals more advanced than they first appeared? Her heart skipped a beat as she briefly considered all the possibilities before shaking her head. No sense getting excited just yet. Pausing only to cut a few bark and wood samples with her knife and sealing them in a container, she continued on. Okay. 41 to generate the next hex, says plains again, so the meadow continues. Well, it is a big tree, so there's a lot of meadow that would open up. But I think next hex, I will veto the first chart and say she disappears back into the tree line. 27 on settlements and ruins says there's an individual dwelling with 1d12 people. 6 people, so it's not a big building. I'm going to ask the Oracle if it's an off-world settlement with a 50-50 probability. 58, so it's not off-world. Samantha has just encountered a handful of the primitive natives. As the meadow continued and the grass began to grow taller, Samantha came across a sight that made her immediately stop and duck down in the tall grass. Ahead of her was a single tent pitched as close to the fallen tree, and by extension the open sky, as it physically could without being on top of the log. A large tent made of tanned hides and treated wood, painted with dyes from the bioluminescent plants found deeper in the forest. It was clearly a native design and only big enough for a large family. Samantha continued to watch the camp for any signs of activity as 100 different questions ran through her mind. The Trailblazers had protocols for interacting with pre-FTL natives, both that had and had not had previous contact with off-worlders. She watched and waited for signs of life, keeping her rifle close to her chest in case those signs of life turned hostile. Does she see any signs of activity? I give it 50-50 on the Oracle. 46, yes, there is some activity. A wisp of smoke traces gray tendrils from a dying campfire nearby as a single figure emerged from under the tent flaps and started to stoke the fires and toss scraps of wood atop it to try and get a good blaze going. Whittled wooden spears were rested tip first into the fire as the fire tender looked up towards the sky and watched the sun and nearby trees. Samantha did the same from her concealed position and checked her chronometer as well. Almost midday, about an hour and a half before noon to be precise, and the sky seemed to be getting cloudy. Probably rain this afternoon. As she studied the clouds, she noticed a flicker of movement from the nearby tree line and the whistling sound of multiple large objects reaching terminal velocity. Samantha barely had time to wonder what was going on. Rolling a 1D. Rolled a 2 on the corpse bomb table for decomposing. A gas-bloated corpse impacted with a fire tender and exploded in a disgusting shower of spoiled viscera and corpse gas that left even Samantha reeling from the utter stench, despite being nowhere near the impact site. Then another, and another thudded into the ground with the strength of a projectile and a shower of nauseating gore. The other people inside the tent screamed and clamored to get out to grab their wooden spears as the creatures landed under the cover of their corpse barrage. This was Samantha's first good look at the apex predators she encountered the night before, and in the daylight they were no less nightmare-inducing. The predatory apex of Paravesh were marsupial gliders vaguely similar to sugar gliders from Earth. If sugar gliders were muscular bipedal predators with a toothy canine face that seemed to be fixed in an expression of perpetual malice. And those eyes. The Trailblazer felt a shiver run up and down her spine every time those glowing eyes looked even remotely in her direction. Samantha's heart was in her throat as she watched the battle play out. She wanted to help them, but she could tell immediately that there were too many of the predators. 6 people inhabited that tent, and there were 3 monsters for every tribesman. Even with her rifle, she suspected she wouldn't be enough to turn the tide, so she hid down as low as she could and attempted to conceal herself further in the tall meadow grass. Okay, Samantha is going to try and make a survival check to try and conceal herself further in the underbrush until the predator leaves. That will be a 1d20 plus 3 for 10. I'm going to say this is a success. I'm going to say that this is a success. Barely, because they're distracted by their prey. Samantha wasn't certain she fooled the creatures, but they were distracted enough by their prey for her to try and look for a better place to hide. Perhaps there was a lip or a hollow in the tree. I'm going to ask the Oracle if there is a space inside the tree and give it a 50-50. 47, yes, there is. Samantha managed to find a spot in the fallen tree trunk that had been hollowed out by some sort of nesting animal and crawled in just as the creature's melee took them over her hiding spot, disappearing inside the tree and holding her breath as she listened and waited for the screams to die down. They eventually did, much to her horror and relief, as it sounded more like the native humanoids were being dragged off somewhere out of earshot instead of being killed on the spot. The stranded survivalist wasn't sure which was worse as she counted the minutes until she carefully stuck her head out of her hiding spot and climbed out. As she continued to walk on and disappear into the tree line, she did not look at the ruined tent. Okay, alright, back to hex generation. We're going to say that she just goes back into a forest hex and see if there's anything of note out here. 962 on the settlement and ruins table says nope, nothing here. Samantha continued to walk along as the forest grew dark from the forest canopy blotting out the sun again. A faint drizzle began to rain down on the forest floor. The human explorer held out a cupped hand and watched as the water pooled in her hand before throwing the rainwater down on the ground in disgust and shame. There was only one way clean rainwater could acquire a red hue on a planet with no signs of industrialization. "Frack this planet," she muttered. Pulling a poncho out of her bag and throwing it over her head before she could get any wetter, she continued to walk along, keeping an eye out to both the trees above and for a shelter she could quickly fortify for the night. It was already painfully obvious that she was as good as dead if she tried to camp out in the open. The forest floor was already a nightmare to navigate, with dense underbrush, occasional bogs of quicksand, and strange floating drones that seemed to vanish right in front of her the moment she looked at them. Hopefully something would go her way soon. Going to roll up another hex from forest to forest with another 16. Settlements and ruins says nope again with a 277. So the immediate hex is empty. Going to ask the Oracle if she can spot anything that would help her on her quest to leave this planet from this hex with a 50-50. 56 says no. Is there at least a cave or something on the forest floor she could take shelter in? Again, 50-50. And 65 says no. Well, at least I'm defining the hex. The forest continued onward. The towering trees continued to leave her in a gloomy sense of unease as she walked along quickly and tried to stick to cover as much as she could. Now that she knew a little bit about the rulers of the planet's ecosystem, other pieces started to fall into place. The massive alien sequoias had bark that bristled with giant narrow thorns. As she squinted to look upwards as far as she could see in the dim light, she could barely make out the mangled remains of humanoids that had been hunted and pinned to the upper thorns like some sort of perverse taxidermy display. Yet wherever she looked, there was nothing that looked like signs of an interstellar civilization or even just a cave or something she could take shelter in for the night. Hopefully things would change as soon as it was already mid-afternoon and she did not relish the idea of facing these creatures after dark by herself. Alright, another hex. First the terrain. 16, which means we're still in the forest. 702 on settlements and ruins means we still have nothing. And I'm going to evoke the Oracle again. Does this hex have anything that might help Samantha get off planet? Again, 50-50. 3 says yes. Is there a cave or something for her to take shelter in? Again, 50-50. And 95 says no. No active or decaying outposts of civilization, but the Oracle says there's something here that might help Samantha get off planet. It was here in this particular stretch of woods that Samantha finally met her true antagonist. Every so often along her hike on this planet, silvery spears the size of baseballs would appear in a halo of smaller magnetic spears the size of marbles and float about several feet above her. The larger spear was covered in strange markings that seemed to glow with a pale half-light that made the hair on her neck stand on end. Yet when she tried to look at it directly, it seemed to vanish. Or did it? Going to use her perception skill to notice what's unusual about the spears and her vigilant trait to try and track them with advantage. 1d20 plus 3, critted for a 23 total. Yeah, she sees it. No, it did not vanish. It merely cloaked and floated away. Tightening her grip on her rifle, and without any other options, she followed after it. The flying drone took her around a massive tree and towards a robed figure that was controlling the machines with a wave of her hand. As the floating orbs swarmed around the robed humanoid, she reached up and pulled back her ornate hood. Samantha recognized the other woman immediately. This was the wizard that stranded Samantha on this planet and scattered the rest of the crew of the Cerberus across this twisted galaxy. The two women glared at each other. Samantha was so tempted to squeeze the trigger on her blaster rifle and put a few rounds into the wizard's torso, but she was fairly certain that the weapon would have little effect on a being that could effortlessly fold space across interplanetary distances. The female space wizard was a slender, gaunt woman with a dark brown hair that otherwise did not look a day past 30 by Samantha's best estimate. Her robes were black with gold-colored trim, and the same glyphs that were engraved in the wizard's drones were also embroidered with silver thread into the golden fabric around her wrists. Overall, despite the relative simplicity of her clothes, there was an impression of incredible workmanship that went into everything from the embroidery on the wrists to the cut of the fabric and how it hanged on the wizard's body. "You're not supposed to be here. I'll have to fix this in post," the robed woman grumbled. "I'm not supposed to be anywhere on this planet, judged by how the wildlife's behaving," Samantha shot back, occasionally glancing above them as she was painfully aware that they were both out in the open in the middle of a ring of those alien sequoias. Each tree likely contained a whole nest of those savage gliders, and enough corpse bombs to turn both women into paste. "Who are you? Where are we? And what do you mean by post?" "I'm the Scream Queen, Nita Ken, Sundermage and the greatest horror movie director in 2 galaxies. We are on Paravesh, homeworld of the Locha trees and the screen. And you are the star of my latest movie, Blood Rain, the terror of Paravesh. At least you were until you found me and broke the 4th wall," the Sundermage replied, dramatically gesturing to their surroundings before back at Samantha. "This is a movie? None of those people actually died?" Samantha asked hopefully. Something about the other woman's explanation was not putting the tough explorer at ease. "Oh, they're very much dead," Nita replied dismissively. "Dragged up to the screen nests in the canopy, skinned alive, and impaled on the Locha trees as an offering. The screen worship the Locha trees like deities or something," the Sundermage continued, describing what happened to the native humanoids like she was talking about the lunch menu at a local restaurant. Samantha understood quite well now. She was stranded on this planet, and her exploits were being recorded, all against her will, for the entertainment of a mad demigod. And for all she knew, the others were in similar situations as well. So what do I need to do to leave this planet?" Samantha asked. "Leave? Leave the planet? No, the script says you die in a dramatic final battle with the Scree. Dozens of them swooping down, their corpse bombs falling all around you." The Scream Queen's voice trailed off with obvious excitement. Samantha shook her head. "No, I'm not dying here. I didn't agree to any of this." Nita smiled. "Doesn't matter. And you have no way of escaping this planet." "We also disagree with this," a deep voice suddenly interjected, projecting directly into Samantha's mind and forcing her to take a step back. Judging by the way Nita also staggered, she was also taken aback by it as well. It was strange. It was a deep voice, but it felt like several voices all coming together to speak as one in some kind of chorus. Samantha exhaled and tried to calm herself, attempting a wisdom saving throw. 1d20 plus 1 for 6. Yeah, that's not really a good roll. Shaken by the sudden mental presence, she barely pulled herself together to respond. "Who said that?" the explorer replied, addressing the unseen chorus. "We have many names. You know us as the Locha," the trees projected telepathically. Continuing to control her breathing, Samantha forced herself to process what she was learning. The giant redwood-like trees were sentient and telepathic, might even be capable of other feats too. That hope gave Samantha Autumns an idea. Before she could even speak, though, the Locha chorus spoke again. "You wish to bargain, Corporal Samantha Autumns of the Soul Federation Scout Corps? We already hear your proposal. We will commune on it." Having been sidelined by sentient trees that were becoming increasingly omnipotent in their abilities, Nita huffed as she glared at Samantha. "What can you possibly offer them, and what can they do to stop me?" Sam smiled wickedly. "I think there's a lot of things that they can..." She began but was cut off mid-sentence, because suddenly Corporal Samantha Autumns was no longer heckling Nita Ken, the Sundermage in the twilight forests of Paravesh. In the blink of an eye, she had gone from standing in the soft dirt of the Paravesh forest floor to the deck plating of the Cerberus exploration ship as it flew through the endless night. Where screens once stared at her with soulless predatory eyes dripping with psychotic malice from their perches in the lorcha trees that judged her, she was now stared at by everyone present on the Cerberus's bridge as she just had effectively popped into existence. 3 friends that looked as harried as she was and several friendly-looking strangers all looked at her expectantly. Putting on her best smile, she waved to the others. "I guess they found my terms acceptable. Hello, everyone. I'm back," Samantha greeted, suddenly feeling so tired as the adrenaline in her system began to fade. End of story.